one of the basic things you're going to end up putting into almost any system is memory, because the need for memory just grows and grows and grows. So let's see how to do that here. I want to start off with the future and work my way back to the past, and then talk about some of the things you've got to worry about when you're purchasing memory. You've seen me do it before, but let me just do it quickly one more time to make sure we get it done. This is an SDRAM. It's the newest, at the moment, kind of memory out there. There's a few options on it that I'll talk about in a minute. Taking them out is really easy, way easier than it was for earlier ones. You got a couple of levers here, and you notice I've cheated and took the motherboard out. Why did I do that? You can do this without taking the motherboard out, and indeed many people do. I recommend, and this is where you'll be throwing the rotten fruit, that you do take your motherboard out when you're going to be doing operations like this, because if you're reaching around in close quarters and you don't have quite the amount of room, I have seen people break RAMs, I have seen people break sockets. So if at all possible, yank the motherboard out before you're going to do memory changes. In any case. Well, SDRAMs are pretty easy. There's a couple of these little white handles here. You just pop these things outward. I say you just pop these things outward. There they go. And at that point, the RAM will come right out for you. And it only goes in one way. If you try to put it in the other way, it's not going to go in, because it's got some little bumps on the bottom of it that align to bumps on the sockets. We got 4 sockets in this guy. And so this particular motherboard can accommodate 4 SDRAMs. Now, not every motherboard can accommodate every SDRAM of every size. SDRAMs are as large as 256 megabytes at the moment. And so you should find out, again, look at the manual that came with your motherboard to find out how big an SDRAM that you can buy. Before I come back to SDRAMs, though, let me talk about some of the other RAMs that you're likely to see, maybe in some other systems. SDRAM, fair-sized memory module. But the original memory module, actually the really original memory module, was back in the old days we would have to plug in lots and lots and lots of little chips onto sockets on a motherboard or an expansion board. In general, the minimum amount of memory chips you would add would be a group of 8 or 9 chips. That was a pain in the neck, because by the time the 386 came around, you had to add 36 chips at a time. You couldn't add 18 or 9, had to add 36 at a time. So to make life a little easier, the vendors started taking what is basically the equivalent of 9 memory chips, sometimes called DRAM chips, and putting them onto their own little circuit board. And their own little circuit board here, this guy is called a SIM, or Single Inline Memory Module. It's just another one of those acronyms. Doesn't mean a tremendous amount. I do not have a SIM socket here, but to give you an idea of how you installed it, you would pop it in, you'd pop it in at an angle, and then you would rotate it till it would click into place on a socket on the motherboard. The problem was that the little plastic things that held it in place were not very strong. And if you weren't careful, it was easy to just snap and break the little plastic teeth off. So if you find yourself having to remove one of these, you're going to find a little plastic triangle here and a little plastic triangle here. Get in there with your small screwdriver, or maybe with your hemostats, and pull them apart, and then allow the SIM to come right out. This is the equivalent of 9 old chips, or 9 bits of memory. They come in different sizes. Now that was a bit of a pain in the neck. It was a bit of a pain in the neck because on a 386 or 486 system, you had to add 4 of those SIMs, single inline memory modules. Well, the idea was that this was just altogether too much work. And so instead, we kind of got SIM Plus. And this original SIM was sometimes known as a 30-pin SIM. It was soon replaced by this bigger SIM called a 72-pin SIM. The 72-pin SIM does the job of 36 or of 32, depending on which one you buy, of these little DRAM chips. The value of that was that just one of these placed into your 386 or 486 system can do the job, can upgrade your memory for you. Again, it's just a variation on the SIM. However, soon after this became popular, an even faster version of the SIM came out called an EDO RAM for extended data out. It's a process whereby you're basically making regular old DRAMs, regular old chips, except they're a little smarter about fetching data, and so they're a bit faster. So we saw for a while there that there were motherboards that had a socket, and there's no difference between an EDO socket and a 72-pin SIM socket. And the motherboards would take Edo if you had it, would take the regular 72-pin SIMs if you had it, but the Edos would run faster. Anyway, so first there was RAM chips, then there was 32-bit SIMs, then we got the 30-pin SIMs, followed by the 72-pin SIMs, which came in two varieties, regular old SIMs and Edo, and most recently, we have SD-RAMs. Now let's talk about SD-RAMs. There's a few things to know about these SD-RAMs. SD-RAMs were built in a time when CPU speeds didn't vary that much. If you read in the book, you can find out more about this, but the short version is there's no such thing as a 400 megahertz CPU. In actual fact, there are really only two speeds in the world nowadays, a 66 megahertz speed and a 100 megahertz speed. Many of the CPUs that you think are 300 megahertz or 333 are only 300 or 333 internally. Externally, they talk to their motherboards and to their memory at 66 megahertz. The slowest chip that actually runs faster than 66 megahertz is a so-called 350 megahertz CPU. The 350 megahertz Pentium II was the first of Intel's chips to have an external speed better than 66 megahertz. Its external speed, or front side bus, is 100 megahertz. Now, why do you care? What does that have to do with memory? Well, if you name almost any chip you're likely to have, 66, 100, 133, 200 megahertz, 266, 233, all these CPU speeds are internal CPU speeds. The external CPU speeds are really just 66 megahertz, which means that they can all use the same kind of memory. The original SD-RAMs came out as 66 megahertz SD-RAMs because they were serving CPUs that talked 66 megahertz to the outside world. However, when the Pentium 350 and the faster chips, and by the way, the 350, the 400, the 450, and the 500 are all 100 megahertz front-side buses. The 366, however, sounds like it ought to be a 100 megahertz front-side bus, but it's not. The 366 is a 66 megahertz front-side bus. In any case, if you have a 100 megahertz front-side system, you need an SD-RAM that's fast enough to keep up with that 100 megahertz front-side bus. And they're called PC100 SD-RAMs. How do you tell by looking at them? Unfortunately, many times you can't. In this particular case, they put a label on this one, but in my experience, they all look the same. So when you're purchasing them, be absolutely sure that you're purchasing a system with a 100 megahertz external bus, a 100 megahertz front side bus, PC100 chip. What if you don't need that? What if you've got a system that's maybe 300 megahertz, only needs a 66 megahertz front side bus? Can you put in a faster memory chip? Can I put a PC100 SD-RAM in where I only need a PC66? Well, the answer is you certainly can do that, but you won't get any speed out of it. Speed of a chip refers to its maximum possible speed, not some sort of internal speed it must run at. So you could spend the money on a 100 megahertz chip and put it in a 66 megahertz socket. You'll just have a very expensive 66 megahertz memory at that point. So make sure you have 100 megahertz if indeed you need 100 megahertz. Another thing to look at is something called registered SD-RAM. In their never-ending struggle to make memory faster, memory developers have now come up with a relatively new kind of SD-RAM, a modification. And once again, they don't look any different, called registered SD-RAM. Registered SD-RAM will be just a little bit faster, but just as in the case with Edo, if you've got a motherboard that uses registered SD-RAM, then you'll get the speed out of it. But if you buy a registered SD-RAM and put it into a motherboard that can't use registered SD-RAM, all you did was spend too much money for your SD-RAM. So we have to be concerned with the speed. You may have to be concerned with whether it's registered or not. But there's a third item that I think is extremely important, and it's a top priority for me. You see, back in the old days, mini-computer and mainframe systems changed the world because they not only had memory systems, but they had ECC, error-correcting memory systems. These are memory systems that if you get a power surge or a cosmic ray or just some bad luck, it will scramble some data in your memory. And I'll bet you've seen that too. Have you ever worked with a computer that's worked lots and lots? I mean, just been working forever, never given you trouble before, and all of a sudden, for no reason, locks up. Many times, the thing that causes that is some memory glitch. What causes memory glitches? Could be power surge, could actually be cosmic radiation. Believe it or not, memory chips themselves are mildly radioactive, very, very mildly radioactive. And about once every 3 to 6 months, memory chips emit a radioactive particle. And if you get unlucky and that radioactive particle hits the memory itself, it randomizes it and corrupts the memory. That's extremely bad news, right? So it'd be really nice if we could not only detect an error in memory, but correct it as well. This ECC memory, as I said to you, used to be a very expensive feature. But now, and here's the amazing thing, now you can get it for free. I don't know why manufacturers don't exploit this, but there are two kinds of SDRAMs. I know I've told you about PC100 versus PC66. I've told you about registered and non-registered, but now I want to tell you about something else as well. You see, these SDRAMs normally contain 64 bits of memory. You can, however, buy a slightly more expensive version that has 72 bits of memory. And that extra, what does that work out to, 8 bits of memory can be used to detect and correct memory errors. Here's how it works. Again, 64-bit and 72-bit SDRAMs look exactly the same. Let's say that I purchase a no-name clone from, Jeff and Akbar's House of Clones, and I go and buy myself some 72-bit SIMs instead of 64-bit SIMs or SDRAMs. I pop the 72-bit SDRAMs onto the motherboard of my system. I turn it on. And inside the system, there is a configuration screen you've probably seen called some folks call it the CMOS configuration or the BIOS configuration. And one of the screens in there is a screen that controls, if it's a Pentium 2 system, will be a screen that controls ECC. And you'll see one of these settings is ECC, set it on or off, or auto or off. Most manufacturers figure they can save $10 by selling you 64-bit SDRAMs instead of 72-bit SDRAMs. Well, if you spend that extra $10, you pop in the 72-bit stuff, tell the CMOS, tell the BIOS to use ECC, and when you turn your system on, you will never have a memory error. Because what ends up happening is if you get a memory glitch, the circuitry on here detects it and corrects it, never even bothers you with the problem. You're running something like NT that uses a tremendous amount of memory, thing lock up on you periodically, I'm guaranteed it's a memory problem. Ward that thing off with ECC. It's a wonderful feature, and it's practically free. I have no idea why everyone doesn't do it. So, in sum, we've seen how to put the memory in here. We've seen there's different kinds of memories. I mentioned in brief that there are different banks of memories. Back in the old days when we were working with these 30-pin SIMs, we had to put 4 of them in to make a 486 happy. Nowadays, that's not too much of a problem because one of these SDRAMs does the job for you, where on a 386 you had to add 4 of these at a time. On a Pentium 2 or a Pentium system, you need only add 1 of these. So, memory, get to know them. Get your upgrades when you buy it. Be sure to buy the 72-pin, not the 64, and turn on the ECC, and life will be quite good memory-wise.